In Netflix's kingdom, a dead king opens his eyes. The palace says he is ill. The ministers whisper. The physicians are afraid to speak. Outside the capital, people are starving. In the villages, the sick begin to change. The dead do not stay dead. A kingdom that already feels rotten from the inside is suddenly forced to face a disease it cannot understand, cannot control, and cannot hide. It is one of the most powerful images in modern Korean television. Joseon, the elegant kingdom of scholars, palaces, silk robes, and royal rituals, turned into a country of hunger, locked gates, abandoned bodies, and people running through the night. But the most important thing about Kingdom is not the zombies. The fear was not that plague came. The fear was that plague came, and the palace might do nothing. The resurrection plant is fiction. The undead king is fiction. There is no record of a flower that could bring corpses back to life. No hidden epidemic of walking dead in the royal annals. No secret report from Joseon that proves the impossible was real. That is not where the truth is. The truth is in the fear underneath the fantasy. Joseon did know plague. It knew smallpox, measles, fever, dysentery, cholera in the later period, and diseases that the records could describe but not always diagnose in modern terms. It knew years when harvests failed and hunger moved through villages before the disease arrived. It knew what happened when a body could not be buried properly. It knew how quickly rumor could become its own kind of infection. It knew that a sickness was never only a sickness. In a Confucian kingdom, the king was not merely a ruler. He was responsible for moral order. When heaven sent drought, flood, famine, or epidemic, the court did not treat it as random misfortune. It was a sign that something in the realm had gone wrong. So the real terror was not simply that people got sick. The real terror was this: plague came, and people looked toward the palace, and it felt as if no one was coming. Not because Joseon had no relief systems. It did. The court recorded disasters, sent orders, opened granaries, moved grain, discussed medicine, and performed rituals. But for the people at the edge of the system, in a hungry village, beside a feverish child, in front of a body no one dared to touch, those systems could feel impossibly far away. Kingdom turns that distance into horror. It takes a question that haunted real societies long before television existed. What happens when disease enters a country and the people no longer believe the rulers will protect them? This is the real history behind Kingdom, not the dead rising, the living being abandoned. Kingdom begins with a rumor about the king. He is sick, or he is dead, or he is something worse than dead. That rumor matters because in Joseon, the body of the king was never just a private body. It was political, it was ritual, it was cosmic. The health of the ruler and the health of the kingdom were imagined as connected. A sick king could mean a succession crisis. A dead king could mean factional conflict. A hidden king could mean ministers were lying. And when ministers lied about the king, the entire realm became unstable. This is one of the places where Kingdom understands Joseon very well. The show does not need the king to be a detailed character. His body becomes a secret at the center of power. The palace walls are beautiful, but they hide something decaying. Officials continue to bow. Servants continue to move silently through corridors. Ritual language continues. Yet beneath the order is panic. Real Joseon politics could be just as tense without any supernatural element. A royal illness was a matter of state. Court physicians reported symptoms. Ministers asked after the king's condition. Treatment could become politically dangerous because the king's survival affected every faction at court. If a ruler died, the next question was immediate. Who controls the heir, the queen dowager, the regency, the royal seal, the announcements, the mourning rites? The annals of Joseon are full of illnesses, treatments, debates, warnings, and anxieties around the royal body. They do not read like ghost stories. They read like a government terrified of uncertainty. That is why Kingdom's infected king is such a strong metaphor. The disease starts at the top. The body that should symbolize order becomes the first sign that order is lying to itself. In the series, the palace does not respond to truth. It responds to danger. It hides the king because the truth would threaten the people who benefit from secrecy. The sick body becomes a political tool. The court's first instinct is not to protect the realm, but to protect its own arrangement of power. That is the real bridge between fiction and history. Joseon was not ruled by monsters. It was ruled by human beings. And human beings in power often fear the loss of power more than the suffering of people they cannot see. When a king became ill, officials could speak in the language of loyalty while quietly calculating succession. When disasters struck, ministers could debate the correct ritual response while local families waited for grain. When a disease spread, the court could record, discuss, and command. But a command from the capital still had to travel over roads, through magistrates, clerks, storehouses, and local power. Between the royal order and the sick child, there was distance. Kingdom fills that distance with the undead. History filled it with something quieter. Delay, fear, hierarchy, hunger, and the suspicion that the people at the top were still playing politics, while the people below were dying. That is why the sick king works. He is not only a monster in a palace, he is a symbol of a state whose center has become diseased, and whose sickness will soon spread outward. Joseon was one of the most carefully recorded kingdoms in the world. For more than 5 centuries, its court kept the annals of the Joseon dynasty, the Shillok, day-by-day records of royal decisions, political debates, disasters, rituals, crimes, appointments, punishments, weather, diplomacy, and illness. These were not private diaries. They were institutional memory. They were the kingdom speaking to its future self. That matters for a story about plague, because Joseon did not treat epidemic disease as something outside government. Disease appeared in the records because disease threatened the order of the realm. It killed subjects. It emptied villages. It disrupted taxes, labor, military service, farming, burial, and ritual life. It forced the court to ask what kind of ruler could allow suffering to spread so widely. The words in the records are not always the words modern medicine would use. A chronic fever might be described by symptom rather than pathogen. A disease that swept through a region might be named according to how people experienced it, not according to a laboratory diagnosis that did not yet exist. So we have to be careful. We cannot simply read every old term as a modern disease with perfect certainty. But the pattern is clear. Joseon people lived with recurring waves of infectious disease. Smallpox was one of the most feared. It scarred, blinded, killed children, and left families permanently marked. Measles could sweep through communities with terrifying speed. Dysentery and other intestinal illnesses followed bad water, movement, crowding, and hardship. In the 19th century, cholera entered Korea and brought a new kind of panic, so sudden and severe that people struggled to understand what had arrived. One outbreak became especially notorious. In 1821, during the reign of King Sunjo, cholera spread through Korea with a speed that terrified people who had never seen anything quite like it. Contemporary records describe a disease that could seize a person suddenly and kill quickly. It moved from port and trade routes into crowded settlements. People called it by names that suggested something monstrous and alien. The disease was new enough and violent enough that ordinary explanations felt too small. This matters because Kingdom is set in an imagined Joseon, not in one exact year. It is not a dramatization of the 1821 cholera epidemic, but the memory of a kingdom repeatedly struck by diseases it could not fully explain belongs to the real historical world. Disease was medical, but it was also moral. If a child fell ill, a family did not only ask what medicine might help. They might ask which spirit had been offended, which ritual had failed, which guest had entered the house unseen. Smallpox in Korean culture was often personified. It could be called ma-ma, a word also used for a high-ranking presence, or sonnim, a guest. It could be feared, honored, coaxed, and sent away. Disease had manners. Disease had moods. Disease had to be treated almost like a visitor with power. This does not mean people were foolish. It means they lived in a world where the invisible needed a language. Before viruses could be seen, illness still had to be explained. A fever moving from house to house demanded a story. A child's face changed by pox demanded a story. A village where funerals came one after another demanded a story. The court had its stories too. A disaster could be understood as heaven's warning. The king might issue self-critical statements. Rituals might be performed. Officials might debate relief, medicine, tax remissions, and grain distribution. The moral universe of Joseon linked governance, heaven, and suffering in ways that made epidemic disease politically dangerous. Because if people were dying, someone had failed. The question was who? For the court, the answer could be complex. Bad weather, poor harvests, local mismanagement, lack of medicine, corruption, fate, heaven, human error, and the limits of the age, all mixed together. For a hungry family, the question was simpler. Is anyone coming? Kingdom takes that gap between official record and lived terror and makes it visible. The series understands that a plague in Joseon would not only be a medical event, it would be a crisis of trust. The records might preserve orders from above. The people below might remember only the silence before help arrived, or the silence when it did not. Before the dead rise in kingdom, the living are already hungry. This is not background detail. It is the emotional ground of the entire series. The people at the bottom are not safe-fed citizens suddenly attacked by a strange disease. They are already weakened, already angry, already used to being ignored. The plague does not create the kingdom's injustice. It reveals it. That part is historically powerful. In pre-modern Korea, famine and epidemic were often connected. A bad harvest did not only mean empty stomachs. It meant weakened bodies. It meant people moving in search of food. It meant families selling possessions, leaving home, gathering near roads, markets, temples, or government offices. It meant grain stores became political. It meant local officials became the difference between survival and death. Joseon had seen disasters of this scale. In 1670 and 1671, during the reign of King Hyunjong, Korea suffered what is remembered as the Gyeongshin Great Famine. Abnormal weather, failed harvests, hunger, and disease struck together. The disaster was not a single bad season. It was a national trauma. People died from starvation and epidemic disease. Families broke apart. Some left their homes in search of food. The state tried to respond, but the suffering exposed how fragile the system could become when climate, harvest, disease, and administration failed at the same time. A generation later, another catastrophe struck under King Sukjong. The core disaster is remembered as the Bulbyong Great Famine, centered on 1695 and 1696, with suffering and recovery stretching through the late 1690s in many places. Again, cold weather, poor harvests, hunger, and disease combined. It was not just that people lacked rice. It was that the entire moral promise of the state was tested. If the king was father to the people, then famine asked whether the father could still feed his children. This is the world behind kingdom's hunger. Not one exact famine, not one direct historical model, a memory pattern. The Joseon state had relief systems. It maintained granaries. It could order grain distribution, tax reductions, loans, and local relief. Confucian government was supposed to care for the people, especially in disaster. A ruler who ignored famine was not only ineffective, he was morally suspect. But systems are not the same as salvation. Grain had to exist in the storehouse. Officials had to release it honestly. Roads had to allow movement. Records had to be accurate. Local elites could not be allowed to hoard, manipulate, or profit. The court could command compassion, but compassion still had to pass through human hands, and human hands could fail. That is the terror Kingdom understands. A starving person does not experience government as an idea. He experiences it as a locked storehouse, a missing official, a tax demand that did not stop because the harvest failed, a noble family whose rice jars still seemed full, a rumor that grain had been sent but never arrived. In the show, hunger makes the infected world feel believable because it removes the distance between monster and victim. The plague spreads through bodies that have already been abandoned by the social order. People do not become dangerous because they are evil. They become dangerous because hunger has stripped away everything that made normal life possible. Joseon elites understood this fear. They wrote about famine. They worried about wandering people. They knew that hunger could become unrest. A starving population was not only pitiable, it was unstable. If people believed the state could not feed them, they might stop believing in the moral authority of the state itself. That is why famine was political. It asked whether the king was truly a father to the people, or whether that phrase was only ritual language spoken in comfortable rooms. Kingdom sharpens this into horror. The hungry people are not simply background victims. They are the measure of the kingdom's failure. Every empty bowl says something about the court. Every village without food says something about the palace. Every body that collapses before the plague even arrives makes the same accusation. The monster is coming. But hunger came first, and hunger was not supernatural. One of the deepest fears in a Confucian society was not only death, it was improper death. To die without care, to die far from family, to be left unburied, to become a body that could not be washed, clothed, mourned, named, and placed into the order of ancestors. In Joseon, burial was not a minor custom. It was a moral obligation. The living owed the dead proper rights, and through those rights, a family understood itself across generations. Epidemic disease attacked that obligation. When sickness spread quickly, the rituals that made death bearable could become dangerous or impossible. Families might fear touching the body. Neighbors might fear entering the house. Officials might restrict movement. The poor might lack coffins, cloth, land, or labor. In severe disasters, there could be too many dead for normal care. During great famines and epidemics, the problem was not abstract. Historical records and later accounts repeatedly describe the same kind of social breakdown. People leaving home, families unable to care for the sick, corpses becoming a public burden, local officials struggling to count, feed, move, or bury the suffering. The precise numbers vary by source and period, and we should be cautious with them. But the fear itself is unmistakable. A body without rights was not only sad, it was wrong. This is where the zombie image becomes more than spectacle. A corpse in Kingdom is never only a corpse. It is a body that has escaped the moral order. It cannot be mourned properly. It cannot be placed safely among the dead. It returns as accusation. Real Joseon did not have walking corpses, but it had the fear of bodies out of place. An unburied body was a social wound. A family that could not perform rites had failed in one of its most sacred duties, even if the failure was caused by poverty, disease, or official order. A community that could not care for its dead had lost more than people. It had lost the structure that made suffering meaningful. This is why epidemic disease could feel like the end of the world, even when the world continued. The house became unsafe. The sick room became feared. The body of a loved one became something people approached with trembling. The boundary between filial duty and self-preservation became unbearably painful. Do you wash the body if touching it might kill you? Do you bury your parent if the village tells you not to move near the house? Do you perform mourning rites if hunger has already taken your strength? Do you obey officials or ancestors? Kingdom turns these questions into movement. The dead chase the living. But beneath the chase is an older terror. The dead have not been settled. The society that should have contained death has failed to do so. This is also why the palace setting matters. Royal death in Joseon was surrounded by some of the most elaborate rituals in the kingdom. Mourning clothing, funeral offices, processions, tomb construction, ancestral rites, ranks of officials, precise language, precise timing. The body of a king was given the full machinery of state. But what about the body of a starving villager? What about the body of a child in a plague house? What about the body of someone too poor to be properly mourned? Kingdom places royal secrecy and common death side by side. The king's infected body is hidden and managed by power. The people's bodies spill into public fear. That contrast is the point. A kingdom that can preserve ritual around the throne, but cannot preserve dignity among the hungry, has already revealed what it values. The sharpest fear in kingdom is not that the plague exists. It is that the people responsible for stopping it may not want to stop it quickly enough. Power hesitates. Power hides. Power calculates. Power asks what the truth will cost before it asks whom the truth might save. This is the engine of the story, and it is the part that connects most strongly to real history. Joseon political ideology placed enormous responsibility on the ruler. The king was supposed to nourish the people. Officials were supposed to act as moral administrators. Local magistrates were not only tax collectors and judges. In times of disaster, they were expected to organize relief, report conditions, maintain order, and protect vulnerable people. There were institutions for this. Joseon used public granary systems, relief grain, tax remissions, and emergency orders. Kings issued instructions. Ministers argued over policy. Provincial officials sent reports. Local magistrates were expected to open storehouses, register the hungry, manage wandering people, bury the abandoned dead, and prevent unrest. So the simple version is wrong. Joseon did not literally do nothing, but that is exactly why the fear is more interesting. Because a state can do many things on paper and still fail the person waiting in a village. A good magistrate could matter. A corrupt magistrate could devastate a county. A slow report could mean late grain. A false report could hide suffering. A factional court could spend its energy on power while the countryside deteriorated. A relief order could be sincere in the capital and useless by the time it reached a mountain village. This is why the phrase "the palace did nothing" is so powerful, even when the historical reality was more complicated. It describes a feeling, the feeling of a subject who does not see the annals, does not hear the debates, does not read the royal orders, does not know which ministry argued for what measure. He sees his child's fever. He sees the rice jar emptying. He sees the neighbor's house closed. He sees the official arrive too late, or not at all. From that distance, the entire state can look like silence. Kingdom dramatizes this silence through corruption. The people in power are not simply overwhelmed. Some of them are willing to let the disease serve their ambitions. The plague becomes part of court politics. Bodies become evidence to hide. Truth becomes dangerous because it threatens succession and authority. Real history does not require a secret zombie conspiracy to make that believable. All it requires is a society where ordinary people understand that elites can survive disasters differently from everyone else. The wealthy can store grain, the powerful can move, the connected can receive warnings, the poor wait. This difference is where political fear begins. Disease is frightening because it can enter any house. But inequality decides which houses have medicine, food, distance, information, and protection. That is why epidemic disease so often becomes a test of legitimacy. A king can survive a bad harvest politically if people believe he tried to save them. A court can survive disease if people believe relief was honest and suffering was shared. But when subjects believe the palace is hiding, hoarding, lying, or protecting itself first, plague becomes more than a medical disaster. It becomes judgment. Kingdom understands that judgment. The infected are terrifying, but they are not the true accusation. The true accusation is aimed upward, at the officials who knew, at the gates that stayed closed, at the palace that continued its rituals while the countryside starved, at the rulers who waited too long. When people cannot see the cause of death, they begin to see meaning everywhere. A strange visitor, a bad wind, a spirit, a punishment, a curse, a guest who entered the house without being invited. In Joseon, epidemic disease existed in a world where medicine, ritual, Confucian morality, Buddhism, shamanic practice, and folk belief all overlapped. People could seek herbal treatment and still fear spirits. Officials could discuss practical relief and still perform rituals. Families could care for the sick and still speak to disease as if it had intention. This was not contradiction. It was survival in a world where the invisible killed. Smallpox is one of the clearest examples. In Korean culture, it was often personified, treated with language that suggested a visiting power. People could call it mama, giving the disease the kind of respectful address used for a powerful presence. They could call it sonnim, the guest. The disease could be feared, honored, coaxed, and sent away. Families might make offerings or avoid angering the visitor, not because they lacked love for the sick child, but because they were trying to negotiate with a force they could not see. Later stories even personified epidemic spirits more directly, giving the invisible a face, because the human mind resists meaningless suffering. Kingdom uses a fictional plant and a supernatural infection, but its emotional world belongs to this older pattern. Something unseen enters the body. People search for an explanation. The official explanation is not trusted. Rumor spreads faster than authority. This is one of the most accurate things about epidemic fear. Disease does not move alone. Stories move with it. A rumor can close a road before an order arrives. A rumor can make people hide the sick, abandon the sick, blame outsiders, blame officials, blame ghosts, or blame the palace. A rumor can become more powerful than the truth because it answers the question people are really asking. Why us? Why now? Who failed us? In a well-trusted society, official explanation can calm fear. In a distrusted society, official explanation can sound like another lie. That is why kingdom's court secrecy is so dangerous. Once the palace hides the truth, every later truth becomes suspicious. If the king's condition was concealed, what else is concealed? If the plague was known, why were people not warned? If the officials are safe, why are the villagers dying? Rumor fills the space where trust should be. The supernatural in Kingdom is not a rejection of history. It is a way of showing how history feels when people no longer believe they are being told the truth. The infected become visible fear. The plant becomes visible mystery. The night attacks become visible rumor. But the deeper force is invisible. Distrust. Once distrust enters a country, every cough sounds like evidence. Every closed gate looks like betrayal. Every delayed order sounds like abandonment. Every body becomes a question the palace cannot answer. The monster in Kingdom bites. Distrust spreads without touching anyone. Kingdom is not real history. That needs to be said clearly. There was no resurrection plant in the official records. No undead epidemic. No hidden archive proving that Joseon fought zombies. The series is a work of imagination, built from political thriller, period drama, and horror. But fiction can be historically truthful without being literally true. Kingdom works because it understands what kind of fear belongs in Joseon. Not modern laboratory fear. Not a clean disaster managed by specialists in protective suits. Not a government press conference with charts and microphones. Joseon's epidemic fear belonged to roads, storehouses, magistrates, shamans, physicians, rice jars, ancestral rites, locked gates, palace rumors, and the moral burden of kingship. It belonged to a world where disease could mean heaven was displeased, where famine could make people question the virtue of officials. where improper burial could wound a family for generations, where a child's fever could be treated as both medical crisis and spiritual visitation, where the king's body and the people's bodies were imagined as part of the same moral universe, even if they were treated very differently in practice. That is why the series feels Korean in a way that goes deeper than costume or architecture. The hanbok matters, the palace matters, the bamboo hats, mountain roads, government offices, and village courtyards matter. But the real historical texture is emotional. It is the fear that order is only a performance, that the court can speak of virtue while common people starve, that ritual can continue while bodies pile up beyond the gate, that the powerful can name suffering, record suffering, and still fail to reach the people inside it. This is the same kind of truth that made other Korean stories travel. Squid Game was not a documentary about a real island, but the pressure beneath it was real. Parasite was not a census report, but the architecture of inequality felt real. Kingdom is not a plague record, but the fear beneath it belongs to history. The show succeeds because it does not ask whether zombies existed in Joseon. It asks a better question. What would happen if the dead could show, with their bodies, what the living had been forced to endure in silence? The resurrection plant is fiction. The abandoned village is not. The undead king is fiction. The political danger of a sick king is not. The horde is fiction. The terror of hunger, rumor, and bodies without care is not. That is why the infected are not merely monsters. They are the return of everything the court tried not to see. Hunger returns. Disease returns. Buried truth returns. The bodies of the poor return to the palace gates. In that sense, Kingdom's fantasy tells a historical truth with unusual force. A country does not need the dead to rise in order to be haunted. It only needs the living to believe they have been left behind. At the center of Kingdom is a simple reversal. The people are told to fear the infected. But the more you watch, the more you understand that the infected are not the beginning of the horror. They are the consequence. The beginning is hunger. The beginning is secrecy. The beginning is a palace that protects itself before it protects the people. The beginning is a kingdom where truth has to climb down from the throne before it can reach the village. And by the time it arrives, the village may already be gone. That is why the series stayed with viewers around the world. The Korean setting was specific, but the fear was not. Every society knows the terror of looking toward power during a disaster and wondering whether help is coming. Every society knows the anger of watching leaders speak calmly while ordinary people carry the cost. Every society knows how fast rumor grows when trust has already died. For Joseon, this fear had its own language. The king as moral father, the court as guardian of order, the granary as proof of care, the funeral as proof of humanity, the annals as memory, the epidemic as judgment. Kingdom gathers these old meanings and gives them a modern shape. It does not tell us that Joseon had zombies. It tells us that Joseon had everything a zombie story needed: hunger, hierarchy, disease, secrecy, abandoned bodies, and people who feared that the palace would keep its rituals even if the country beneath it collapsed. The real history behind Kingdom is not one plague. It is not one king. It is not one hidden case in the annals. It is a pattern of fear. When sickness comes, will the rulers tell the truth? When the harvest fails, will the storehouses open? When the poor die, will their bodies be honored? When rumor spreads, will anyone be trusted enough to stop it? When the people cry out, will the palace hear them? History answers quietly, in records of disease, famine, relief, ritual, failure, and fear. The dead did not rise in Joseon, but disease came, hunger came, rumor came, bodies waited, officials failed, the court debated, villages suffered. And somewhere in that distance between palace command and village survival, a fear took shape that still feels familiar today. The fear was not only plague. The fear was plague in a kingdom where the people believed the palace might do nothing. That is the real story behind Kingdom.